right, good afternoon. All right, MMI would like to welcome Mr. Ed O'Neill as our first Commandant Speaker Series this year. Mr. O'Neill graduated and was commissioned as a second lieutenant through MMI's ECP program in 1980. He went on to finish his bachelor's degree and enter into active duty as an Army medevac pilot and an aeromedical evacuation officer. He left the service in 1992 to pursue a civilian career with Progress Rail and served in leadership positions, including the Vice President of Leadership Development. Mr. O'Neill retired earlier this year to pursue his continued passion of helping people develop servant leaders in business and community service organization through his new venture, Unfazed Leadership. He has served on numerous MMI boards and is a true friend of the school. Please welcome Mr. Ed O'Neill.
So I've got three different things hanging around my head here. I had to take at least one of them off. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here. This is really the first time in months that I've seen real people that weren't on the other side of a Zoom screen. So just the ability to get out and spend a little bit of time with you is great. And I always love coming here as well. I really screwed up as a cadet, big time, in a lot of ways. And I gave the colonel my biography, and the good thing about that is you're able to write your own biography in a lot of cases. They say, hey, tell me a little bit about yourself. You give it to them, and you give them all the good stuff, right? But I did screw up. And I was thinking about it this morning. I called my old company commander. I was in Echo Company first, and then in Band Company. And on the way down here, I called the guy who was my company commander my first year and said, hey, I'm going to talk to the cadets today. There are a couple of things I'm not sure I remember quite as well. At 60 years old, your memory maybe goes a little bit. And usually I can remember things that maybe happened 30, 40 years ago, but not as much things that happened yesterday. But, you know, some of those 40-year ago memories are a little bit difficult as well. But he helped me out. And one thing he reminded me of is that towards the end of my first year as a C1, I was promoted to lieutenant, which was something that was very unusual. I was a first-year cadet. Back then we had a high school, and but I did not come here in high school, so I was truly in my first year here, and I guess I was in the right time, at the right time and in the right place, and I became a cadet lieutenant. Well, when that happened, a lot of other things went through my mind, and I started believing a lot in my own press about how good I was, what I'd accomplished, what allowed me to get to the point where they would honor me with this. And I started thinking about myself something like this. Now, back in 1970, the movie Patton came out, and this was George C. Scott playing General Patton during the Second World War. And you can see the uniform and all the medals, the sashes, all of that stuff. I mean, this guy was a walking showboat. And that's what I thought of myself when I pinned on that lieutenant insignia, cadet lieutenant insignia, my first year. And in a lot of ways, I felt like I was being honored because of how great I was and how much I'd accomplished. But I realized very quickly that there was something more to leadership than the rank and being able to wear something on your uniform that to outsiders might impress them. It was far less impressive to my fellow cadets than it was to me. And I learned that quickly towards the end of that C1 year when I had an incident with a fellow cadet, a high school student. He was actually in his fourth year of high school, and I was much older than he was, 1 year older than he was. So I felt like I had it all going on. And very soon after I was promoted to that rank, I had this incident with this other cadet. And the commandant found out about it, and I was called into his office, and he very quickly let me know that I wasn't everything that I thought I was. But he gave me the opportunity to continue in that leadership position. but not without some significant counseling, I guess, in the right direction. There's something about leadership that isn't necessarily readily apparent to you the first time you're given that opportunity. But after many years, I was able to pick up on things, and really much of that happened here, but it was solidified years later as I began to move through various leadership positions in the Army. And one in particular was during my last tour of duty in Alaska, flying medevac helicopters. And if you aren't too familiar with Alaska, this is a pretty big mountain. Anyone know what that is? Have an idea? This is the interactive part where I kind of, ask questions and you all have feedback and respond to me. Who knows what that is? Think about the tallest mountain in North America. McKinley, also known as Denali, which is the native name for it, okay? So we were all over that place, and I talked at commencement a couple of years ago about a particular mission that I flew there, and the mountain played a significant role in that. But the mountain is not really what I want to talk about, and really not about Alaska either, but it more has to do with what was going on inside that helicopter and with the people that were on board. I was the pilot in command of this helicopter. Not this particular one, somebody else took that picture, I wasn't on board, but when I flew, I was the pilot in command. And again, you look at that and say, man, that's pretty impressive. I can tell people what to do on that helicopter, and they need to snap to it and obey it right away. And that included anyone of any rank who was on board, because I was in charge of that helicopter. But hopefully, by the time you get in that position, you realize that leadership is not as much what you're able to tell people, but what you're able to influence them to do appropriately. And much of that has to do with crew coordination and building trust with your team. So you find yourselves, you're all C2s, right, in here, second year. Many of you are in leadership positions. I think earlier this week you had a ceremony where you took an oath as a cadet leader. Am I right? Okay. Some of the things that you're required to do as a leader may require you to step back a little bit from your authority and realize that it takes a little bit more than being able to tell people what to do. Now, on this crew, I had a medic, I had a crew chief, and I had a co-pilot. And while I could tell them exactly what to do and they would have to, quote, obey me, in many cases I wasn't doing that because, for the most part, they're able to see things that I'm not able to see. They're able to listen to things, they're able to see things inside the helicopter, outside the helicopter that I can't possibly do. And besides that, my workload is such that I can't possibly say grace over everything that's going on in there. So you have to step back and trust your team, and they have to trust you. Now, we talk a lot about trust and leadership, and there are really two components to that I think are important. And the first is that your team believes that you're competent. In other words, that you know what you're doing. Now, as a young leader, you may sometimes question your experience and whether or not you're really the right person for the job. Now, you may not, but in many cases, you step back and say, I'm glad I'm in this position, but I don't necessarily feel like I know everything I have to know, and that's good. Because you want to be self-aware and understand what you don't know, because you don't know what you don't know. So having people on your team that are willing to tell you that is critical. So they have to believe you're competent, but they also have to believe that you have character. So the two C's, competence and character. Character means that you can be trusted to do the right thing, and your word is your bond. And when you tell somebody something, they can take that to the bank. It's something that they can believe in. And again, it goes both ways. They have to believe that you're competent and you have character, and you have to believe the same thing about them. And it took me many years to really get to the point where I believe that. Now, there's something about leadership that requires that you shift gears rapidly, and you've faced a lot of that in the last few weeks. How easy has this whole COVID thing been for you? What do you think? How easy has it been? Cakewalk, piece of cake, no problem? Okay, we do a lot of sign language in Alabama, especially for those of you who aren't here or aren't from here, and it goes something like this. This means yes, and this means no. Has it been easy? No? Not so much. I mean, there are a lot of things that nobody has experienced before. None of us saw this coming. None of us knew how it would affect us and how long it would affect us. But you, as leaders here, are right in the middle of this, and everything that you're doing right now can have a significant effect on the trajectory of not only your life and your career, but that of those around you, those you come into contact with, and really, to a large extent, even those you don't come into contact, because if we don't do the right thing with this, it can spread to people you don't even know. So being able to step back and understand that you have a role in this that goes beyond what your personal needs and wants dictate is very important. So how do you do that? Well, a lot of it is being able to shift rapidly depending on the particular situation that you're in. Sometimes, again, by that definition, it's called situational leadership. And it looks something like this. This is almost a mathematical formula, although it's not that simple, right? You've got to have a little bit of sense about you to know when to apply the particular formula. But it goes something like this, that leadership style, your leadership style, is a function of the person times the situation. And that person can be both you, but it can also be the other people that you're working with, those that are on your team, those in your company, those in the band, those in your cadet organization. All of those people around you respond differently to different leadership styles. Some of these styles can be long-term styles, and others are short-term. Can anybody give me an idea what I mean by that? What would be maybe your personal definition of what a long-term leadership style would be? Any idea? Think of it this way. What was that? The president is, okay, so certainly the president needs to exhibit some long-term leadership styles, but does he or she also have to exhibit some short-term leadership styles? Let me help you out with this, and I'll give you some examples that may help you understand what I mean by that. And that has to do with some suggested styles. And based on a lot of research, this is one list that some people came up with to talk about the different styles that a leader can use in different situations. And the ability to rapidly switch between these styles is important because a really effective leader is able to draw from a repertoire, a toolbox full of these different skills and use them at the right time with the right person. So here's the test. Would you say that a directive style, in other words, telling people what to do and expecting them to jump and do it, is a long-term or a short-term style? Short-term, why? Given at that moment, has to be executed during that time frame. Thanks for that. So this is something where, and we're not saying any of these styles is good or bad, it's just knowing when to employ them at the appropriate time and not employ them at other times. So directive is a short-term style, works real well in the short term, but if you keep doing that over a long period of time, eventually it kind of wears out its welcome and it doesn't do quite as well. How about having a visionary leadership style? And the idea here is that you can cast a picture, cast a view of what things are going to look like out there and down the road and in a bigger picture than what we're seeing right now. Long-term or short-term? Long-term, yeah. Again, it's that big picture, longer term. How about affiliative? And this is kind of pulling people together, building that team spirit, building the capability to work together. Long-term or short-term? Long-term, good, you're getting the hang of this. Participative, similar, right? But this is using the ability and the strengths of everybody on your team to accomplish something. Long-term or short-term? Long-term, good. Pace setting. And this is the idea that you're out in front, you're not necessarily telling people what to do, but you're leading the way and you're saying, follow me. Long-term, short-term? Long, short, kind of a mix, right? It's kind of a hybrid, right? If you do this for a long period of time, eventually people get worn out. You want them to be able to do these things themselves without you necessarily having to jump out ahead every time. Now think about situations that you've been in where you've led people, teams, and so forth, and the styles that you use. And we'll look at the last one, which is coaching. Long or short term? Short? Long? Hybrid? Okay. I can buy all of those. Really what that ends up being is kind of a hybrid, right? But the idea about coaching is that you're moving somebody from one place to another. And it doesn't necessarily mean telling them what to do. Somebody comes to you to be coached. They don't want you to tell them what to do. It's more asking questions and drawing them out and getting them to decide which direction they need to go. It's asking great questions and then being able to sit back and be willing to listen for the answer that they come up with. So there may be a little bit of telling, but there's an awful lot of just sitting back and listening. And somebody said this morning. It's the whole idea that you got two ears and one mouth. And, the old story is you've got to listen twice as much as you're talking, and that's exactly what a coach does. So think about, again, situations that you've been in where you've been required to respond to differing situations. Maybe you have people on your team that respond very well to one of these or another. Somebody who's less experienced, has less skill in a certain area, you may need to be more directive with them until they kind of learn the process. Somebody who's very experienced, has those skills, in a lot of cases, you can sit back and watch them go. In some cases, maybe just a little nudge here and there with coaching or providing a great vision, and they say, I like that, I'm going to run with it. And you don't have to tell them the details. They figure it out themselves. Your style as you're learning to lead is very important. So a couple of questions about this. Tell me some of the characteristics of the best leader you ever knew. Anybody? Just give me one. In the back there, loud so I can hear you. They knew how to learn from mistakes. Great. Give me another one. They have integrity. Give me some more. Competent. Courage. Selflessness. Listening skills. Humble. Any others? That's a great list. Now, the other side of that is there's some people that don't really exhibit a lot of these things. And, when you're thinking about that last list, you may have been thinking about a particular person that you've seen model this. Maybe it was a leader that's here now, somebody that you've had in the past, a coach, a teacher, a friend, somebody, if you've been in the military, a military leader that you've known, all sorts of people. You may run into somebody who doesn't exhibit those things, and I really don't want you to tell me who those are, but what are some of the attributes of the worst leaders you've ever known? What are they like? Yes, sir. They're a narcissist. What are some others? Do as I say, not as I do. Lazy. Selfish. What was that again? I'm not hearing it. I'm sorry. Oh, cocky. Okay, good, good. I've got helicopter ears, right? Sometimes they don't work quite right. Give me a few more. Ignorant. They don't know what they don't know, right? What else? Hypocritical. So it goes back to that competence and character thing, right? You can't really trust what they say because they may say it here 1 minute and the next minute they're saying something completely different, or they're acting in an inappropriate way based on what they've already told you they are. So I want to suggest something to you, and that is, at least in my experience, and a lot of others have talked about this, written about it, studied it, and pretty much bear this out, that the best leaders are servants first. They're servants first. In fact, that's what they think about before they ever think about what I was doing in putting on that Patton uniform as a cadet lieutenant, right? You know, they aren't the ones that are thinking about what they can get out of it, how they can show up, how they can, be admired by people. What they're thinking about is what can they do for others? What can they do for their team? And this really demonstrated itself clearly in my time in the military. And I remember one time in particular, got to Alaska with my wife, 3 small children. One of my pilots was sick right at Christmas time, and we kept a helicopter at Fort Greely, Alaska, 100 miles away from Fairbanks. The day before Christmas, I took this guy's duty, went down there, and I sat there for a week. Christmas morning, knock on the door in the barracks. It's my battalion commander with my wife and 3 children and a whole bunch of presents, and they'd driven 100 miles in a snowstorm with presents and food for my entire crew, left my family there for one night, and the sergeant major came back the next day and picked them up and took them back to Fairbanks. I'll always remember that. What do you think my engagement was at that point? And what do you think I felt about that battalion commander and that sergeant major? Did I feel good about them? You bet I did. Bert Kincaid was my battalion commander's name. Wonderful guy. We'll remember him forever for what he did there. And I can point back to many leaders over the years that did exactly that thing, and I can remember them very clearly, much more clearly than the ones that did not act in that way, although I do remember a few pretty bad leaders as well. And the characteristics of them were they were in it for themselves. A lot of the things that you talked about with the worst leader, they demonstrated that. The best leaders are servants first. Robert Greenleaf wrote about servant leadership back in the 1960s and 70s, and he coined the term servant leadership, although the idea is old, it's ancient, right? Goes back to biblical times or even before. And he said this about servant leadership, that the servant leader is servant first. First. That's his or her first thought. Becoming a servant leader begins with a natural feeling that one wants to serve and to serve first. Not to lead first, but then there's a conscious choice that person makes that brings one to aspire to lead. So they start out with the desire to serve, but naturally it moves into leading because they realize that they can serve many more people by becoming a better leader. That person is sharply different from the one who's leader first. So think about you, and think about how you've been honored in many cases with leadership positions. Is it your desire to be a leader for you, or is it a desire to be a leader for the team, for the mission, for the people that you're serving? The difference manifests itself in the care taken by the servant first to make sure that other people's highest priority needs are being served. The best test and the most difficult to administer. You kind of know it when you see it, right? It's hard to really have a test for this where you can check it off and say, yeah, they're all about that. There's a lot more to it than that. The question is, do those served grow as persons? Think about your company, your platoon, your sports team, the White Knights or the Swamp Foxes or whatever other cadet organization you're in. Do those you lead grow as people? Do they become healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous? In other words, able to operate on their own without all that direction? Are they more likely themselves to become servants? In other words, can you replicate them? Have you replicated them by serving them such that they now believe that their best path is to become a leader? The big idea here is if you seek to lead, you must first learn to serve. Learn to serve. And it may not necessarily be easy. You may make mistakes, like the mistake I made as that young cadet lieutenant that first year. I'm going to go through these quickly and kind of lay out a case for why you should want to be a servant leader. 5 benefits. Cheryl Backhelder, who was the president and CEO of Popeye's Fried Chicken, right? Go figure. Great leader. She's all about servant leadership, but in her book, Dare to Serve, she said, people will tell you the stuff you need to know. Wouldn't you like to have that instead of them keeping it secret from you? People will be more likely to follow your bold vision. So if you're this visionary leader, it's not enough just to lay it out. If people aren't willing to follow you, then it's useless. But if you serve them, they're more likely to follow that. People will actually do the stuff you need to get done without a lot of reminding. Again, they become more self-starting, able to do the things they have to do, and they perform better. And then finally, people watch out for you to protect you from yourself. Boy, I wish I'd had more of that back when I was in your shoes. I needed a lot of protection from myself. And I suspect that some of you might too. Servant leadership looks like this in terms of a hierarchy. Often we see it depicted as a pyramid where the leader is up at the top and everybody's underneath them, and the implication is their job, the people underneath, are there to serve that person up at the top of that pyramid. With servant leadership, we flip that on its head, and the leader is at the bottom, and his or her job is to serve those at what is now the top of that pyramid, and not think of him or herself first, but think of them first. You have no right to call yourself a servant leader, though. A friend of mine, Ken Jennings, wrote a book about this, and he said that if you want to be a servant leader, it doesn't depend on you, but it depends on those who you serve based on whether or not you help them or you hurt them. So years ago, and I didn't know this guy. I came along after he did. But George Washington, I like to think the story is true, but I don't know that it necessarily is. There are a lot of legends about guys like George Washington where you hope they're true, but you don't necessarily think they are. Things like chopping down a cherry tree and maybe throwing a silver dollar across the Potomac River and things like this. But this story, I hope, is true, and it looks something like this. It was probably at Valley Forge during one particularly bad winter, and Washington is out reviewing his troops, and he comes across a bunch of soldiers laboring to build something. Maybe it was a shelter to get out of the elements. Maybe it was a military emplacement of some kind. But he came across them and noticed they were having a very difficult time actually accomplishing their task. And he rode up on his horse, and he noted that there was a corporal who was giving instructions, shouting out encouragement, shouting out instructions, and they still weren't having much luck with what was going on. I hope I don't trip over these things. So he rode up to the corporal and he said, "Mr. Corporal, I see your men are having difficulty accomplishing their mission. Why don't you help them?" And the corporal said, "Sir, did you not realize that I'm the corporal?" And General Washington said, "Yes, Mr. Corporal, I did realize that." And he got down off of his horse, and he loosened up his jacket, and he went to work with them until they were able to accomplish their task. And then, wiping the sweat off his brow, he said, "If you should ever need help again, call on me, Washington, your commander-in-chief, and I will come." See, there's a lot more to servant leadership than listening to a speech or reading a book or watching a video or something like that. It's all about action. It's doing something. It's humility, being willing to serve alongside those who you think signed up to serve you. It's gratitude for people who sacrifice day in and day out to get the mission done. It's the generosity of spirit to give back to those who have absolutely nothing to give you in return. So the next time you're tempted to stay on your high horse, rely on your rank, rely on your position or something else, remember Washington and dismount and serve. I want to say one more thing, and I've run out of time here, but I want to talk about my shoes here. And again, I'm glad I didn't trip over these laces. They're extra long. One of the things you can't forget to do throughout all of this is, even as straight-laced and conservative as you may be, sometimes you just need to lighten up a little bit. And I don't mean horseplay. You still need to do the right thing and stay within the boundaries that have been set. But sometimes you just need to lighten up and cut people a little bit of slack and realize that everybody's having a hard time and that you can help them achieve what needs to be done, but they don't have to be miserable doing it, and you don't either. So if you have an opportunity and you have some purple shoes, figuratively, not literally, I guess here, put them on from time to time, and you'll be glad you did. How are we doing on time, sir? I think I'm done. Thank you.
Ed, thank you very much.